Thank you very much. The moment I walked in this morning, I got 2 homework assignments, but there are gifts, and thank you for the gifts. I really appreciate it. And this morning, I have a presentation to give you some background as to what we've done to complement Governor Malloy's vision to create a second chance society here in the state of Connecticut. But before I do that, I'll share with you what led to that circumstance. Chip got into a little bit in my background, but before I got involved in corrections, I come from a large family. I was privileged to go to a great school, Northeastern University up in Boston, come back, was teaching, and had a lot of student loan, and 4 other brothers and sisters. And by the way, at one point in time, we were all in college. I don't know how my parents did it, but in fact, I had them over for dinner last night, and I think they're still traumatized by it. But that being said, I needed a job in the summer, and a friend of mine talked to me about they hire these, what they called summer temps in the Department of Correction to fill the void for people when they're on vacation in the summer. And would you be interested in doing that? If you are, I can make arrangements. And I said, why not? And I did it and never left. And May, I will be in this business for 30 years. And so fast forward, in 2009, I became the warden of the Garner Correctional Facility in Newtown, Connecticut. And it's a facility that's specialized in many ways, but its overall goal and mission is to provide treatment for folks who have been diagnosed with significant mental illness. And I became very passionate about the needs of that population. And it really took me out of my bailiwick in terms of what type of relationships that you need to have in order to create an individual approach to assist the folks that we're trying to help. And that required me to begin the process of meeting with the families of incarcerated people. And generally, that doesn't happen in corrections. It's an adult correctional environment, and we treat folks like adults. It's difficult enough, but I felt that it was very, very important and significant to forge a relationship. And quite frankly, it was one of the smartest things that I ever did in that role, because we created some collaboration and partnership, and we were able to actually make some important segues into areas that we had not achieved previously. I can tell you that that was unique, and a lot of my colleagues actually were at one point somewhat critical. And I can tell you a quick story. Whereas I had just met with a family about the needs of a loved one, and I was coming out, and one of my colleagues was in the parking lot, and I walked the family out of my office and said goodbye, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I had a meeting with the family, and we were just kind of trying to work out a plan here to deal with some circumstances with this incarcerated person. And he's like, "Why would you do that?" And I was like, "Why not?" And but that's just a quick story about kind of the unique exposures that I had starting out when getting up into those higher levels of leadership positions. Once you're a warden, I'm at the pinnacle of my career. I'm good. That's where I want to be. There's other levels of administration to get to deputy commissioner and commissioner, as Chip was kind of going briefly through my background. But my predecessor, the warden of that facility, ultimately became the commissioner of correction. And he quickly moved from deputy commissioner to the level of commissioner. And when he became commissioner, he asked me to be his deputy commissioner, and I kind of jumped over some folks to get to that role. And I didn't quite understand although it's happened historically in the agency, why he wanted me to be the deputy commissioner, quite frankly, initially I said no. Part of the reason was politics. I didn't know who the next governor was going to be. It was the election of the second term of the governor. I needed to work, and although warden positions are appointed positions, which means that you can go whenever they bring in a new administration, normally those are safe positions, but the deputy commissioner positions and the commissioner positions aren't as safe. That being said, I talked it over with my wife and my son about whether I should do this or not, and it was my wife who said that I had a good rapport and relationship with the gentleman's name was Jim Zarenda. He said, your relationship will not be the same with this person, with Jim, if you don't support him. And that was good enough for me. And I accepted the position as deputy commissioner. And this is where, and I really appreciate, Eric, your story, and I don't want to be a downer, but I know that you praise God for the gift that you received. But I accepted the position of deputy commissioner, and I was a deputy commissioner of operations and rehabilitative services. And Jim Zarenda was the commissioner. Jim Zarenda took a job in New York at Rikers Island 9 months into his commissionership. And I was called frantically by the governor's office, saying, are you going to New York as well? And I said, oh, New York, what are you talking about? I didn't even know he was going to New York. And I said, no. And they said, well, would you be the interim commissioner? And I said, sure. And they want to do a national search. That's what they always say in a paper, but they pretty much already know who they're going to pick. But that being said, at the same time, I was in September, a little over 3 years ago, I was out on vacation, staying at a home of a friend who actually lives right here in Darien. And he has a home on the West Coast. And my son, Matthew, was not feeling well. And when he got back, we brought him to the doctor, and we weren't sure what was going on. We went to, his blood work was coming back, and they wanted us to go to the children's hospital. And we got there, and that was in September, and Matthew was diagnosed with this very rare form of cancer. And he died 3 months later, on New Year's Day. And I have to tell you, and I know this is somewhat of a faith-based organization, that for a long time and to this day I still struggle and have been very angry with God about that. And I'm told that's okay. So Matthew was a student at the Gunnery School in Washington, Connecticut. I live 12 miles from there. I never expected him to be accepted into that school, but he was a very smart young man and very witty. But when he was in the hospital, we were dealing with what I can now reflect on as a lot of trauma, a lot of exposure that ended up in tragedy. And at the time, I told the governor that I was not going to take the position. I was going to retire. And I remember going back to the hospital, and my wife or myself were always there with him. We never left him once. And we had this discussion, my wife and Matthew, our only child. He was 15 years old. And we never left his side. And we'd have a lot of discussions about, it was a big deal that, he was seeing stuff on the news that they got this guy, the interim commissioner, his name is Scott Semple. He got to watch it up on, from the hospital. And it was Matt who told me to do this. And he was very witty, and of course he made a joke about it, and he says, you always want to be boss in this, and you're never the boss even when you're the commissioner. Everybody has a boss, and we all know that. But there was interactions that Matt had had with me when I brought him to the Garner Correctional Facility. He met with incarcerated people, and he had some very interesting interactions. And he says, you should do this. And my wife said, no, you should do this. And 2 weeks after Matthew passed, I told the governor that I would accept the nomination, and the process started. So I'll never will refer to this as a gift, but what happened to me was I became very bold because the worst thing in my life has already happened. So I began to think about where do we want to take the Department of Correction. And I had some general ideas of what we can do. I was looking initially for low-hanging fruit. I intend to share that with you today, but I think it was important that you hear my story. So my wife and I still struggle with this. And in fact, it was a very emotional morning for me, just being here. And quite frankly, I do a lot of speaking engagements, and I want you to know you should feel privileged because I very rarely talk about this. Long story short is we began this journey of trying to figure out where to take the Department of Correction, how to complement the governor's second chance initiatives. And I remember meeting with this man, our governor, and I'm a Republican. And the first thing I said, do you know I'm a Republican? And he had said to me, he said, some of my best friends are Republicans. But we sat down and we started to philosophically discuss. Basically it was my interview, what to do, where are we going to go with this thing? And we talked about hyper-incarceration, mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s of, how did we get to this point? Because back in 1988 when I started, there was a little over 7,000 people in the Department of incarcerated in the Department of Correction. In 2007, there was 20,000 people incarcerated in Connecticut. 3.4, 3.5 million people. That's a large, large number. And my predecessor already began the process of driving down the numbers. And I had already had a framework of where I thought we needed to go. But the one thing that he had said to me that, where I said you had me at hello, was he talked about mass incarceration, and he said, in the 80s and 90s, we built all these prisons when we should have been building schools. Yeah. So I was all in, because remember, I started out teaching, right? And the journey began. And I will get into it a little bit, but there's some of the things that I'm going to share with you this morning, and some of them originate out of my exposure. I know you showed the video about Norway. Well, I went to Germany in June of 2015, and what you saw is referred to as the European model. And I got to see the German version of the European model. But just let me put some perspective on that journey. I landed in Berlin. And the census in Berlin is consistent with the census in the state of Connecticut, about 3.3, 3.4 million people. And I I had never been to Europe before. And my first visit to Europe was 5 days of going to prisons. And I can remember interacting with my counterpart. And I was there with 3 other people in my role from around the country, a bunch of advocates, some prosecutors, some judges, some different types of people, and the 60 Minutes crew did a story on it and about the German model or the European model. And I was 60 Minutes, it starts out tick, 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 tick. My wife says I was barely a tick in the segment of 60 Minutes. But that being said, 3.3, Connecticut's very similar. We're in Berlin, and one of the first questions we asked, how many people are incarcerated in the region of Berlin? And remember what I said, right now we have roughly about 13,700 people. We've driven that population down significantly. They have 4,000. And the numbers that you just saw about Norway are pretty consistent with the experience of Germany. And so we go to the German prisons. As you saw, there was people that were standing around there. There's dignity and there's hope and there's humanity in the system. And it's really driven about getting people, correcting people to get them back into society. And the whole environment is much different. So we went to a facility which was commensurate with what a level 4 facility is, a maximum security environment. You saw that in the video with Norway. And although the incident rates are very, very low in Connecticut, meaning bites, assaults, and things of that nature, in comparison to other systems around the country, the incident rate at this facility, the first facility that we went to, was 0. There are no incidents. And there was some other very obvious differences. One was infrastructure, and the milieu itself was very, very different. And you could see that it was very, very, the infrastructure of those facilities architecturally were designed to improve one's wellness, to create a healthy environment. Now think about that in comparison to our prisons here in the United States. They are built for efficiency. How many people can you put into this concrete structure at the cheapest price? And although we call ourselves a Department of Correction, our recidivism rates are a good example of giving you an indication that we may be failing. And I really, really attach myself to the thought process of, despite what anyone has ever done or will ever do, without hope, there's just chaos. And so it began the process of trying to influence the staff to make a cultural shift, to move in a better direction, to create a healthier environment, not only for the wellness of the population, but the wellness of the staff, because the fact of the matter is, the staff are exposed to levels of trauma that the general public just doesn't understand. I talked, I think, that Channel 8, I didn't even remember that Channel 8 thing that I did. It was a reimagining prison thing. Thank you for wherever you found that. But if you consider the circumstances of that, I tell my staff that the general public has a television perception of what prison is. And we think that it's designed to punish. And at one point in time, we train our staff to be black and white thinkers, very policy driven. Ed, who's a police officer, I think he can relate to that. You go to the training academy, it's very policy driven. Why do we do that? Well, we do that because we want a place for you to go when you're dealing with an emergent situation. So you know how to respond to the circumstances that you're going to deal with. And then you find out, whether you're a police officer or a correction officer, that your interactions with people are very gray. It's very, very different. And that was very obvious to me with my exposure to that mental health facility, that facility that was specialized at the Newtown Correctional Institution, whereas I had to really do some out-of-the-box stuff and start meeting with these families to see if I can create a relationship and a rapport that would be positive in nature and improve one's overall health, and also to give them some level of hope. So thank you for bearing with me. It's very difficult to share the personal aspects of what got me into this position. What I'd like to do for you is to briefly run through what we're doing right now. And then certainly would be willing to entertain any questions that you may have. But hopefully I'll get this right. This tie right there is the tie that I wore when I went before the legislature for nomination. It is my son's school tie. So these things are now called pillars. I call them things, right? Thing 1, thing 2, thing 3, thing 4. Now we have these 6 pillars, and I'm going to talk about what these pillars do really briefly, because I don't want to bore you. But I put some very simple performance measures in play with these initiatives, or these themes or pillars, or whatever you want to call them. But I felt that I was very compelled to make it very visual. So when you walk into our central office, and there's several people here I've had the privilege of meeting with in my office, you have to walk by these pillars. And each one you're going to learn about this morning. Here they are. There's 6 things that we did to complement the Governor's Second Chance initiatives. And that was the creation of what we call the Centralized Community Release Unit, or CREW, Risk Reduction Earned Credit Enhancements, the creation of reintegration centers. It's kind of Overhaul, Parole, and Community Services. There's about 4,600 people right now in our communities that are being managed by our parole officers. A focus on emerging adults. And lastly, impacting the female population. So, in order to establish CREW, before we did that, we had to have a strategic plan. And our strategic plan, off on the right here, you can't see it, focuses on 3 main areas: public safety, efficiency, and wellness, with an emphasis on wellness. So why CREW? One of the observations that I made when I first became commissioner and looking at community release packages, these are people who are going back into the community, was that I had at the time 15 correctional facilities, and I had 15 wardens, and every one of them had a different opinion of how to manage someone in the community. And we would get these packages to put people out, and within these packages are stipulations. But if you looked at the background and the history of someone who has been with us in the system, and then you compared them to the stipulations, it was all over the board, right? Because it's natural for one's perspective on things and their own perception to stipulate certain things. And I remember having this discussion with one of my colleagues at the time who was a warden, and he really, really had issues if someone was incarcerated on a gun charge. And he would just stipulate the heck out of that particular individual. Well, science tells us, and we know this, that you need to rely on assessment and validated assessment tools that have undergone meta-analysis and everything that goes along with it. And I won't bore you with all of the science aspects of it, but what I will tell you is that if you overmanage, the likelihood of failure increases. So we really wanted to take a more kind of pinpoint effort to ensure that we were very consistent and had a continuity in our decision-making process as we were putting people back into the community. So what did that do for us? Not only did it create continuity and consistency, but we increased reviews by 34% in 2015 when we first launched this. And as you can see, in 2016, between January and December, we were able to review 10,000 plus cases, and we were able to approve roughly 55% of those cases. And so our community numbers went up by double. Next is risk reduction earned credit. I'm a big believer that it's important to send a message to incarcerated people that if you work hard and are accountable to yourself, then we will be accountable to you. So they have this thing called REC, risk reduction earned credit. You've probably heard it called good time, right? And some people are very critical of it, but actually it's a very effective tool inside correctional facilities. So it's really an opportunity to incentivize, right? So in the perfect world, when someone's incarcerated, they go through an assessment process and they start out at a facility based on that assessment determination. But what we want them to get to is the lowest level of security that we possibly can, because it has the highest level of programming opportunity. And that's what we want everyone to do. And it doesn't always happen, but if you incentivize, you can influence it. So I changed REC. So we have different levels of facilities. We have level 5 facility, which is referred to as supermax, 4 is max, 3 is moderate, medium, 2 is minimum, and 1 is when you're in the community. So rather than give everyone the same amount of credits at whatever facility you are, 2 through 5, I gave more credits as you transition down into the lower level facilities. And the outcomes of that were pretty astounding. Now, keep in mind the strategic initiatives. I'm not going to get into the details of this. I'm going to get into the impact of how we improve the overall wellness. This is the slide that I don't really want to get into. I kind of talked about it. But here are the data points and performance measures from last year. As a result of doing this, inmate assaults went down by, you can see, 16+%. Fights went down by a little over 5%. Staff assaults went down by 13.5%. And disciplinary reports, which is what we use as a penal code of discipline to deal with behavioral issues, went down by 13%. Next. This is a funny story. I hope I can make you laugh today, because I didn't get off to a good start. We created reintegration centers, and I felt like, in the interest of being bold, I renamed a correctional facility to what you see here as the Cybulski Community Reintegration Center. It used to be the Cybulski Correctional Institution. And we created some specialized housing there. Now, how did we get there? It was purely by I was just fortunate that I had picked up a trade magazine while I was at work, because I was supposed to go to some conference and I couldn't figure out where it was, and I flipped to the wrong page and I started reading this story about reintegration units in Ohio. This is interesting. So I send 3 of my staff to Ohio, and they come back from Ohio and they say, we can do this in Connecticut, and we can do it better than it's done in Ohio. So we renamed this facility, and we began the process of creating a different environment, a therapeutic environment that is designed to deal with the specific needs of the population in terms of what they had been exposed to while they had been incarcerated, to reacquaint them with the programs that they had received, and then to also emphasize programming that would be necessary and appropriate for them to be successful as they re-enter the community. Job skills, just how to tie a tie. The things that we just take for granted. Eye contact and all these different types of things, starting to give them the opportunity to interact with technology, which traditionally doesn't exist in correctional environments because of the concern about victimization and the World Wide Web and all the things that come with my obligations and our agency's obligations to be responsive to victims, and which we should be. But my argument about that is, as a society, we say we're a forgiving society, but the stigma of incarceration can last a whole lifetime, and I don't call that forgiving. And we have to move away from the stigma that comes with incarceration. And this environment is designed to begin that process. So, what did it do? And I should add that we created this reintegration unit. There's now one that exists at the York Correctional Institution for Women that's located in Niantic. And we have a hybrid version at the Manson Youth Institution in Cheshire, Connecticut. But here's what it did. The Cybulski Reintegration Center recidivism rate is 21% compared to the straight right return of 55%. And then one of the specialized units was the creation of a DUI, home confinement, and we increased the approvals for that, as you can see, by 56%. So we created an environment that's working, it's improving people's lives, and it's impacting recidivism, because that's what everybody measures the Commissioner of Correction against. So every time I show up at the legislature, it's about recidivism. I don't focus on recidivism, even though I'm talking about it this morning. I focus on a generational impact, and that will take care of recidivism. So really quickly, parole and community service, Overhaul. We have been fortunate enough to receive a multi-million-dollar grant, and we're moving away from a law enforcement type of management of people who are in the community. We're very good at dealing with problematic people. We're not good at correcting people and being able to properly manage people in the community, give them the skills and the services that they need in order to be successful as they go back to their families, hopefully. And we are kind of in the midst of this, and I thought this was going to be one of the low-hanging fruit scenarios. We're 3 years into this, and we're still working on the programming and the training and everything that comes along with it. The Life on Parole, I don't know if you've seen it. It features Connecticut. It's a frontline documentary about 4 parolees and their experience and interactions with our parole officers. Some of those interactions, quite frankly, are not viewed as good, and some of them are. But I think it's important to be transparent to the folks that have certain expectations of how our state agencies are going to run. Here is the TRUE unit. TRUE unit stands for, as you can see, truthful, respectful, understanding, and elevating. And I always have to read it because I didn't come up with it, the consumer did. Some people call them inmates. And this program is about family contact, staff and family engagement. Makes sense to you. You heard me talk about Newtown. And family participation, right? The stuff that corrections typically doesn't deal with. This came to us from Germany. Well, on the latter part of that trip, we went to this particular facility, and it was designed for emerging adults, 18 to 24, 18 to 25, to treat them in a different way. It talked about a lot about all the dynamics of neuroscience and brain development. The brain's not fully developed to the age of 25, and that this is a much more impulsive population that really struggles and is easily manipulated and makes poor decisions just because the frontal lobes of the brains aren't developed, you know. And I remember trying to educate myself coming back from Germany, and I met with a doctor at Yale who was a neurologist, B.J. Casey, and I said, so why are they, you know, if everyone has an underdeveloped brain, then why are some people incarcerated and some people not? And she said, well, the frontal lobe of the brain, you have two lobes, are parents. Your parents influence you and have the ability to assist you in making appropriate decisions. You need help, is what she was trying to say, or what I'm trying to say. I come back from Germany. The governor was with me on that trip. He told me, I like this. I want it done in Connecticut. I said, okay. I started to query what the population looked like here in Connecticut, and as you know, that was back in 2015. We had about 16,000 folks that were incarcerated, and roughly 3,200 folks were within the age group of 18 to 25, and they were responsible for 25% of the incidents that were occurring in our facilities. So my original intent was to repurpose an entire facility, and then the budget woes hit the state, and could have scrapped it. So I decided to downsize, and I went to a unit philosophy. So we dedicated a unit within a correctional facility. Now, mind you that if you believe in the notion of neuroscience and brain development, it was important that we took some challenging projects on, right? Some folks that had some history of being impulsive, whether they may have assaulted another incarcerated person or a staff member, and we wanted them to take on, we did not want them to take on cupcakes, is what I'm trying to tell you. So we began this journey to open up this unit rather than a facility. And I partnered with the Vera Institute, which is located in New York, because they had sponsored the trip to Germany. And I needed some help because I could not find a lot of details, scientific details of how brain development can be impacted within a correctional environment. So the Vera Institute went on their own journey trying to find a system in our country that does this, because it's just like the reintegration units, they'll just steal it, or I'm sorry, borrow it. And nothing like this exists. So we had to create it. And in order to do that, we had to invest in our staff. And we had to influence our staff. So we were transparent with them. We talked to them and said, look, there are this many people in the system, they're responsible for this many incidents. We want to improve the overall wellness of your work environment. And if we could do this, are you in? And people volunteered. And we trained 100 staff, 3 weeks of very specific training to deal with the circumstances that evolve around neuroscience. And a year and 13 months ago, that unit opened. I just went to the 1-year anniversary, and I will tell you a little secret. I spoke at that event, and I was mic'd up like I'm mic'd up now, and there was that same group of people that starts out the show, tick, 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 and they want to do a piece on this unit. There's nothing like it in the country. We'll see if it happens. They took what they call B-roll, and I'm not a media pro here. I'm sure we have some, and then called me the very next day to say that they want to come back. So I talked about what this age group is responsible for, and then let me just share this with you about the True unit. Next month we open up the Worth unit, which is an emerging adult unit for females. This is working. So we're 13 months into this, we have had, now remember what I talked about, that level 4 facility in Germany. We have had 0 incidents in this unit.
Come on now.
Yeah. So that's my spiel. This isn't my stuff, but I want to thank the New Canaan Society for your work that you're doing at the Bridgeport Correctional Institution. I also want to thank my friends and colleagues from Kairos who have been kind enough to do a lot of work here in Connecticut. And the Kairos project is something that was happening in Connecticut, and it went away. And I was approached about it when I was the warden at Garner, and we reinstituted it. Now it's at several of our facilities, and we're expanding, and I appreciate your work. And Chip, thank you for having me.